Okay, I think we'll make a start. There's the last few people just joining. Firstly, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our Energy Insights, a strategic review of energy policies. It's going to be presented by some experts from our EDF Net Zero Policy and Strategy team. So we're going to be looking at an overview of energy policy developments from the new government, a look at energy prices, developments in non-domestic policy and regulation, and we'll have time for some questions on all of that at the end as well. So before I introduce the speakers, I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping. The session's being recorded, so we'll share it with you afterwards, and for those who couldn't join live, they'll be able to watch it on demand. I'm sure there's going to be a few questions coming out of these topics. So if you do have a question, there's a Q&A function, so please submit it throughout. We won't stop for questions in the middle of the presentation, but we'll definitely leave some time at the end to go through those. Any we can't answer, we'll take away, but we'll try and answer most of them at the end of the session. So if we move on to the next slide, just to introduce ourselves, I'm Eloise Ogden, so Senior Manager of Market Development, which is within EDF Business Solutions. And our speakers today, we've got Daniel Alkin, who's the Head of EDF Policy and Regulation for our Customers Division, and Roy Collins, who is the Policy Manager within Policy and Regulation. So that's it for me for now. I'm going to hand over to Dan and Roy to take you through the agenda and begin the presentation. Thanks, Roy.
Thanks very much, Louise. Pardon me. So yeah, and welcome everyone. So yeah, we'll be looking through some of the developments of last year from the new government, with a particular focus on their Clean Power 2030 objectives and some of the associated issues around the upgrade of the grid and connection queue reform. Talk a little bit about where we are on other government policies, including the review of electricity market arrangements. And then I'll hand over to Dan, who will cover some of the energy pricing developments of the past year and some of the policy developments in both domestic and business markets, and a look at flexibility and some of our low carbon heat and energy efficiency topics as well. Okay, so we'll crack on. So I think looking into this 24 review, I think it's probably best to start with the new government and the impact that has had on energy policy. We've seen Ed Miliband and Claire Coutinho effectively swap roles with the victory of Labour in the general election. And I guess the big noticeable change in energy policy and politics from that has been the adoption by the new government of a more ambitious target for the decarbonisation of the power sector, with their Clean Power 2030 target, and I think so far a strong associated focus on renewable energy development to support achievement of that target. So we saw very early on some quite significant policy changes. So firstly, the government expanded the budget for the Contracts for Difference auction that took place towards the end of the summer. And that auction achieved a record amount of new capacity. There was also quite a lot of important policy change around planning. The government has changed the rules around onshore wind to give more support for that in the UK, and has also been consulting on further planning policy changes to give a more sympathetic planning environment for renewable development. Ed Miliband has also approved quite a large number of new substantial solar farm proposals that were on the desk of Claire Coutinho, but weren't decided before she departed. Alongside that, we've seen the start of the creation of GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund, so two potentially very important new government-led initiatives with quite a strong energy focus, But I think it's fair to say so far, although there's been a little bit of detail on those initiatives, there's still quite a lot of uncertainty about how they will operate, the projects and the sectors that they will focus on, and we'll look to see more on that in the coming year. I guess the other probably big overall change that I think we're sensing now in the energy policy area is that some of the consensus that we may have seen in the past around decarbonisation and net zero is beginning to erode, and there is a lot more political debate around ambitious net zero and decarbonisation targets, and we're seeing the Conservatives challenge both the feasibility and the costs of the clean power target and some of the wider net zero policies, and that I suspect is a trend that we will continue to see over the next few years. So we'll look now in the next slide at the Clean Power 2030 target in a bit more detail. So this has definitely been a kind of flagship element of the new government's policies. Very early on, the government appointed Chris Stark, formerly head of the Climate Change Committee, to lead up the Clean Power mission in the Energy Department. And then we've seen a lot of activity in this area since the election. The new National Energy System Operator was commissioned to provide advice on how to achieve the Clean Power 2030 target. And in December, we saw the government respond to that and to publish its own pretty detailed action plan on all the things it aims to do to deliver that target. So important thing to note about Clean Power 2030 is that it does not mean a completely zero carbon power sector in 2030. And the government has adopted the NESO's advice on how Clean Power 2030 should be defined, and that's set out in the slide here. It has a number of elements, but no more than 5% of power to be from unabated natural gas generation by 2030, that the UK or GB generates as much clean power as it consumes, and that it implies effectively some export of clean power, and that overall the power sector carbon emissions are less than 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is quite a substantial reduction on where we are today, with the figures out for 2024 of about 125. So, you know, depending on your perspective, you might say that this target has been watered down, and some of the commentary around that suggests that, but I think perhaps a better way of looking at it is that it reflects the reality of the current power sector, that there is really no feasible way that we could completely remove our reliance on natural gas generation by 2030. I think probably many of you have seen in the papers recently the stories about the tight system just maybe a week or so ago, with very cold weather and not much wind and not much sun. And in those kind of scenarios, we still rely on a lot of gas generation, and I don't think anyone really can see that we could remove our reliance on that completely by 2030. So different views, I think, in the industry and amongst energy stakeholders about how achievable even these redefined Clean Power 2030 targets are. But I think everyone agrees that they're a pretty enormous challenge. To get there, we'll need to increase the rate of new generation deployment, and we'll need to build a lot of storage and an awful lot of grid, and the overall investment programme to deliver that is estimated at around £40 billion per annum. So it's a huge programme. An awful lot needs to happen quickly and to go right to get even close to the target. And that, as a result, has led, I think, to a lot of focus on planning and how to speed up planning decisions, and also how to speed up and address some of the current barriers in terms of the network and the amount of network we need, and the speed of connections. So in the next slide, we'll just take a look more at some of those topics. In order to get to Clean Power 2030 and to connect the large increasing amount of renewable generation, especially wind, that we are building, is a broad recognition that we need a substantial increase in the amount of transmission network and in the pace with which we deliver that network. Under the previous government, Nick Windsor conducted a review of this and looking at how we could bring down the time that it takes between the sort of conception and development of a new transmission project through the planning system and then its delivery. He made a series of recommendations, and I think we're seeing effectively the gradual implementation of most of those recommendations now under the new government. One of those recommendations is for Ofgem to give accelerated approval to key transmission upgrades that everyone agrees are necessary for the future. And we're seeing that with what's known as the ASTI framework, with Ofgem is now approving a much bigger programme of network investment. The network companies are trying to improve their procurement processes so that they're buying all the necessary equipment and skills and workforce to deliver this bigger program in a more coordinated way. In parallel, there's also a focus on can we speed up planning decisions for these new transmission networks, and that's obviously often quite controversial in local areas, which has led to the idea of giving communities that are hosting new grid infrastructure payments, or what's sometimes known as pounds for pylons. There isn't a kind of absolutely firm commitment to a particular scheme on that as yet, but it's definitely something the government is working on. And of course, all of this grid development will have some cost implications. A bigger network does not come for free, and we do expect the costs of TNUoS and other network costs to rise. But perhaps a little bit of a saving grace is that these are costs which are spread over very long periods of time in the regulatory framework. So although the upgrades are very, very substantial, it doesn't mean that there's a comparably enormous increase in network costs. The other big sort of grid-related issue that you may well have heard about or seen some reference to in the papers relates to the connection queue. Now, this is the queue of projects that want or have requested a connection to the network. And the issue here is that that queue has grown to an enormous size, over 700 gigawatts worth of projects. And the parallel issue there is that people coming with new requests are being told that, well, yes, you can have a connection, but not until maybe 2038 or 2039, so very distant time. And now 700 plus gigawatts of projects is far more than we actually could ever conceivably need. And what's happening here is, in fact, that many of these connection requests are speculative. People are putting in multiple connection requests when they maybe only want to actually build one project, but they're not sure of the location or the site. So there's been a big sort of program of activity within the electricity system operator and with National Grid to see how we can address this issue. And the overall concept is effectively to move away from the existing approach, which has been a first come, first serve approach with very low barriers to entry, very easy to ask for a grid connection, to something which is being called first ready, first connected. And the idea here is that priority will be given to the projects which are actually in a position to build, they have planning, they have finance, and they are ready to actually take advantage of their grid connection. So within that, quite a lot of detail on how that will work in practice is still being consulted on, and obviously for any affected project. It's an extremely important question. You know, what's happening to my grid connection, and do I still have it, or when will the date be? So that's going to be a continuing focus, I think, over the coming year. Okay, we'll move on now to the next slide. So we talked about some of the changes that the government has already introduced or been focused on, but I think we should also note that there's a lot of things still to come, or where we haven't yet seen the government make definitive decisions. And the first of those is on nuclear power, where obviously with significant EDF interests here, we're hoping to see progress towards a final investment decision on Sizewell C by the time of the spending review, which is scheduled for later in the spring or early summer of this year. At the same time, there should also be news on the small modular reactor program, which is obviously another major area of nuclear development. Alongside that, quite a lot of other issues that are going to be of growing focus, I think, in the generating sector. We mentioned how gas may only fall to be around 5% of generation by 2030. So that is going to lead to quite a substantial change in the power sector and how it operates. And a large number of gas stations not doing much most of the time could pose both policy and technical challenges for those assets. So we may well see further work on that issue over time. And alongside that, if we're ultimately going to get to a completely clean power sector, we need to move those unabated gas stations off the system and replace them either with storage or some new form of dispatchable low carbon generation, which might be hydrogen or gas with carbon capture or further nuclear and so on. So quite a lot of important policy work ongoing within government, and decisions needed on how, alongside a big growth in renewables and new nuclear, you know, we need some other stuff to keep the lights on in a fully zero carbon way. And more generally, as emissions from the power sector fall, they become less and less significant for the government's wider net zero targets and ambition, and with the remaining emissions are much more concentrated in industry, in the building sector, in heavy transport and agriculture. And so if we're going to make further progress, we need to have policies and measures that will decarbonize those sectors as well. And one of those policies has been, and in EDF's view should continue to be, carbon pricing and the use of emissions trading schemes. We have our own scheme in the UK, the UK ETS, but currently the prices in that scheme are pretty low, and therefore only providing a fairly modest decarbonisation signal. So there are some questions there around whether the government will reform that scheme or look to reintroduce a linkage with the EU ETS, which is something that we did have before Brexit and which could help to strengthen the UK carbon price. And then moving on to the next slide, there's one other big policy topic where decisions are still to be made, which has been a question of substantial debate across the energy sector throughout 2024. And this is under the heading of the review of electricity market arrangements, REMA. This is REMA has been considering a lot of issues in detail, and I think across the sector there is a recognition of the need for reforms to adapt the electricity system to the new world of a majority of generation being from intermittent renewables. But within that, there is a big choice that the government is still to make, which is about whether it would adopt a zonal pricing system or keep a single national wholesale market, but reformed in various ways. And this is a very big decision, a move to Zonal pricing would see different wholesale power prices across different regions of the GB market. And as such, it would affect pretty much everyone in the electricity sector: generators, traders, customers, suppliers, and so on. It would have a lot of knock-on impacts. So it would be a very substantial change. The government has said that it plans to make a decision in principle on whether to adopt zonal pricing or stick with a national market by this summer, so the middle of this year. And alongside that, we may see a range of other detailed reforms as well. But I guess perhaps important to stress for people on the customer's side, even if the government does decide later this year to adopt zonal pricing, this is going to be a long time to introduce this change. There'll be a lot of further consultation, legal and regulatory changes will be needed. So realistically, most people think it would perhaps be another 5 years or so, that sort of time frame, before zonal pricing would actually come into force, if the government does decide to proceed in that way. As far as EDF is concerned, we would tend to favour keeping a national market with reforms. We do recognise some of the arguments for zonal pricing, but we're concerned that it would bring a lot of extra complexity and uncertainty for market participants. So we think overall we would prefer to stick with a national market. Okay, I hope that's been a little bit of a useful overview of some of the broad energy policy developments. I'm going to hand over to Dan now, who will take you through some of the questions of the year on energy prices and domestic and business policy.
Thanks, Roy. So I think we'll start with energy prices before we dive into sort of what's been happening more on sort of retail market regulation, both in 2024 and what we can expect last year. But if we quickly just look at prices, I think the story here in terms of power prices is, you know, we have and we are continuing to come out the other side of the energy crisis. Power prices are nowhere near the highs that we did see back in sort of 2021, 2022. But I think probably, as we all know, they remain higher than they historically have been, and you can see that quite clearly in the graph. And I think the other thing to call out, and it kind of reflects, you know, sort of wider geopolitical insecurities we're seeing across the globe, that prices continue to be volatile, and potentially more volatile than they have historically been. So I think it's just worth noting that that is sort of the pattern we are continuing to see at the moment. If we look forwards, and what does that mean? Obviously, that was looking back. If we look forwards, I thought it was just useful to share a couple of the projections that DESNZ have made, Cornwall, an independent consultancy, make about where power prices may go in the future, along with sort of the landing zone that the National Energy System Operator, NESO, has sort of aimed for in its Clean Power reports. And I think that what that tells you is there is a degree of variability. You know, it's looking into a crystal ball and trying to predict what may or may not happen in the future. But I think it gives a rough outline of where we expect those prices to go going forwards. I think the key thing to note is, sort of Roy alluded to earlier, though, is power prices are one part of the components that may ultimately make up the final bills that we all pay. And there are other factors that will obviously have an impact. And Roy's talked through some of those earlier in today's session. So if we turn to policy development, I'm going to start with the domestic market. I know it's not our main area of focus here, but I think one of the things that I think we probably all know to be true is that quite often it acts a bit as a vanguard, and quite often the development we see in the domestic market ultimately ends up playing through into non-domestic markets in one way or another. So I think it's useful to cover the topics and to make sure people are aware of what's sort of been on the agenda. There's a number of topics that sort of have really dominated, I think, discussions of domestic market regulation over 2024. You know, prepayment and involuntary prepayment has continued to be a very big topic about how suppliers do that appropriately and fairly for customers. How market competition reopens after the energy crisis, in particular the ban on acquisition tariffs and how and when that should continue or whether it should be lifted has been a big area of discussion as sort of the market has started to reopen and switching has started to return to levels that are closer to what we would have seen pre-energy crisis. Smart metering has, of course, remained a big topic. And then there's been a real growing focus, I think, from Ofgem, and I think we'll come on to talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, around how they can be driving improvements in customer service. And it's been a real growing area of focus, I think, from the regulator that we'll see continuing rolling into 2025. I think the other big topics for 2025 remain debt. You know, we saw before Christmas, Ofgem released a figure that debt in the domestic sector had sort of reached about £3.7 billion. That's considerable. It is a considerable number, and I think there's lots of independent forecasts out there that suggest it could increase by a significant amount by the end of this winter, even further. And therefore, Ofgem is very interested in what interventions it can take to try and bring that figure down and ease the pressure that is creating on domestic prices. Standing charges have been a big topic for 2024 and look like to be a big topic in the domestic market for 2025. Ofgem are proposing to require suppliers to offer zero standing charge default tariffs for domestic customers. I think, interestingly, particularly with a non-domestic hat on, they're also looking at whether and how suppliers are charged many of the fixed costs they face, and whether those correct balances, whether the correct balance is actually in place there. Are there some of the cost suppliers faced on a fixed basis? Would they be more appropriately charged on a variable basis that could have impacts across both the domestic and the non-domestic market? But that's a much longer piece of work. And then I think the final thing we saw before Christmas is worth calling out, particularly a domestic focus, as I say, but DESNZ has kicked off a review of Ofgem, and they've launched a call for evidence that's looking at Ofgem's role, its duties, how it regulates, and what powers it has. Again, the focus of that review, when you read the document, is very domestic focused, but inevitably the implications of it will also have across how Ofgem acts and how Ofgem seeks to regulate all of the markets it looks at, not just the domestic market. I think the other interesting thing about 2024 is it was also a year of quite considerable change, I think, in the non-dom market, particularly on the Ofgem front, as we had a number of activities where we'd seen work ongoing for a number of years that sort of reached their conclusions or near their conclusions. So last year saw the conclusion of Ofgem's non-domestic market reviews that they kicked off sort of at the height of the energy crisis, and sort of the big takeaways to come out of that were Ofgem's decision to extend standards of conduct, so the responsibility that sits on suppliers to treat their customers fairly as an overarching principles-based license condition being extended to all customers. Previously, it was limited to domestic customers and micro business customers, and equally the same extension to the rules around transparency on TPI commissions being extended to all customers. The other big change to come out of that was that we've also seen the introduction of a new definition or a new type of business within the regulatory framework, with a definition of a small business being put in place by the government, and a requirement on suppliers to only work with TPIs that are members of redress schemes where they are small business customers, where they are providing contracts, I should say, to small business customers. So that's been a 2.5 year program of work that's reached its conclusions this year and has resulted in regulatory change. The other part of that, and other things spinning out of that, is we've also something that's sort of been long gestating, I think. I think the first call for evidence that the government issued on it was sort of way back in 2019, but we've seen government come forward with a consultation and proposals to regulate third-party intermediaries across both domestic and non-domestic sectors, and something we've long been calling for and we've supported. And it looks like we will see government try and take forward proposals over the next year or so to bring in an authorisation regime, probably a general authorisation regime, but we will wait to see, to regulate TPIs and their activities. I say something that's long been gestating, but it looks like progress is starting to move forwards. And then I'll return to this customer service angle. I think one of the other big tentpoles of 2024 was Ofgem launched a new work programme that they called their Consumer Confidence Programme. And what Ofgem effectively have done is set out a challenge to themselves and to the industry to say, we want to be best in class when it comes to customer service. They want to be able to look across utilities and other service providers, both in the domestic and the non-domestic market, and they want to be seen as the sector that is providing the best quality service. So Ofgem are kicking off a big program of work. It's starting with looking at debt rules in the domestic sector, but I think we expect it to branch out this year as Ofgem looks closely at things like, does it have the right set of outcomes in mind for customers in terms of what its regulations are looking to achieve? And therefore, off the back of that, once you've defined those outcomes, do you have the right principles-based regulations in place to drive those outcomes? And is the current rules we have in relation to prescriptive requirements also correct? And what balance do you need between prescription and principles to get the right outcomes? And I think immediate areas of focus after their prioritisation of debt will probably be things like billing accuracy, I think is one that we can expect Ofgem to look at, and things like guaranteed standards. So those automatic payments that suppliers have to pay to some customers when certain things happen, are those set at the correct levels? Are they in place for the right activities? And then the final thing I was just going to flag was the greenhouse gas protocol. Obviously, international standard underpins lots of corporate reporting. The GHG protocol kicked off a review of their standards back in 2022. That process has been ongoing for the past 2 years, but I think we expect 2025 to be quite an important year, as I think it's the year we can probably expect the GHG to come forwards with updates to their draft standards and put those out for public consultation, with a view to implementing changes from 2026 and beyond. So that will be certainly one to keep an eye out for this year, and one we'll be keeping a very close eye on. I think the only thing I've not put on this slide that is also worth mentioning is smart metering. The current smart meter framework is due to come to an end at the end of 2025. So the current fixed rollout targets that all suppliers have. And I suppose what we will hopefully find out shortly about is what does government seek to do beyond the end of 2025? What does that rollout framework look like? So I think that'll be another big area of focus. And for a shameless plug, both professionally and personally for everyone on the call, if you are with EDF, of course, do get in touch if you have not yet made that change and adopted a smart meter. I then wanted to turn to flexibility, because Roy talked about the Clean Power Action Plan earlier from government. And I think one of the most interesting things in it, particularly from a retailer or a supplier's point of view, is actually some of the big targets that action plan sets in terms of the role that flexibility, both short duration and long duration, will play in helping government meet that ambition. And you can see on the slide that there are some big step changes and increases needed to meet the government's ambition. If you just look at, say, batteries there, for example, the current installed capacity is around 4.5 gigawatts. To meet that clean power ambition, the government have set themselves the target of getting to 23 to 27 gigawatts of installed capacity. That is a big change. And I think one of the other things that we will be looking out for intently this year is the suite of policies or the policy framework that will help us as a business, but also help households, help other businesses make the changes to support that ambition. Because this is ultimately, lots of this will be consumer-led, as the bottom line in that table also shows. And they've promised they will bring forward a roadmap this year that will set out the strategy for achieving those targets. And obviously, it's something we at EDF are very keen to work with government on, and to work with yourselves on as well. But I think it is one of the big developments of this year and the big future areas of policy growth that I think is worth calling out. And then finally, Roy mentioned earlier the impact that looking beyond the power sector and other sectors of the economy can have on achieving the government's wider sort of net zero ambitions. And therefore, I wanted to quickly touch on energy efficiency and heat as two big areas of focus for us here at EDF and in helping Britain achieve net zero. Because I think there's two sort of big events that we can expect next year that will have an impact on how we go about achieving that wider change. The first, more domestic focused, but I think the comprehensive spending review due sometime next year will set out sort of the government spending envelopes for a lot of the work that they plan to do in many of these spaces. the manifesto that the Labour Party ran on committed to increasing spend on improving and decarbonising people's homes and our building infrastructure. And I think we can expect to see the next steps of that plan come forwards alongside the spending review, and policy development spin out about how that's best delivered thereafter. The other interesting thing I think worth noting is government has also said that it will look to bring forward a new industrial strategy next year, and that will include sectoral plans for clean energy industries. Timings on that, we're going to have to wait and see, but it is one worth keeping an eye on. And then finally, from an EDF perspective, it's one that we, and this is an ambition we stand ready to try and work with our customers on, and we are continuing to grow and progress our activities in these spaces through the strategic acquisitions we've made through the likes of SAS Energy, Contact Solar, CB Heating, all about helping our customers move towards net zero. And I think that probably takes us to the end of the policy content, Eloise, and Q&A.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Roy. That's really interesting. So hopefully, I know Penny's just kind of put a reminder in there to make sure people can see it. But if you've got any questions, add them in to the Q&A function. We've got one, so I guess we're going to start with that one. So Roy, you discussed the upgrade of the national grid and that this will be at a cost to all users. So the question has said that TNUoS costs for 25-26 are expected to rise by around 40% year on year. I think this is the first view we've had of RIIO-T3, so it's not definite yet, but it is indicating some significant rises. These will be seen in customers' bills, both domestic and industry. How will EDF support this messaging?
I mean, I guess I'm not quite sure where the question's coming from. And I mean, obviously, network costs are not something we in EDF have any control over. They're a pass-through item in bills, effectively. But you're quite right. That there is a forecast to be this quite substantial increase in TNUoS costs, and we're obviously very conscious of that. I think, as I said in my section on network costs, there is a cost implication to the substantial increase in the network that is needed for Clean Power 2030 and for connecting new generation infrastructure. I think I wouldn't say though that scale of increase that we're seeing is likely to be sustained. I mean that's one probably a one-off big jump, but there will be a somewhat bigger bill probably for some period of time. Perhaps the other thing just to bear in mind on that though is that as we electrify and more people are using electric cars and electric heating and industrial electrification and so on, the cost of the network becomes spread over a bigger overall use of electricity, bigger electricity consumption, and that means that the kind of price per unit of electricity is not necessarily going to see such big impacts if you look at this on a very long-term basis. So I think at a sort of national level, there are some strong arguments that ultimately this is a strong investment for the UK that will put us in a position to take the benefits of stable, predictable wind and other forms of generation and to electrify at an acceptable cost. But obviously we do recognise there are short-term cost challenges for people obviously with these changes. That's probably as much as I could say, Louise.
Yeah, no, thanks, Roy. I guess I was just going to add something from the EDF Business Solutions point of view. Obviously, for those people who are customers of ours, We will give as much information as early as possible as we can as it comes out from the transmission companies through our monitor reports and future webinars as well. So definitely look out for that, because we do everything we can to support our customers budgeting for and there's going to be big changes. We have got a flurry of questions. Oh, sorry, did you want to say something, Dan?
I was just going to say, I think one of the other things that we're of course always looking to do, Eloise, is to have, you know, those discussions with Ofgem to make sure that where policy decisions are driving changes in cost base, that Ofgem are also playing their part in helping to communicate that message as well. I think we've identified from past experience that is an area where collectively more could be done. Yeah,
for sure. I'm going to move on. Got a few more questions. One on somebody's interested in the amount of projects wanting connection to the grid. I don't know if this is a technical one, depending on how your solar panels are installed, but they're wondering, would this affect a company's application to install solar panels for their own use?
I can have a go at that, Eloise. So the figures I quoted in the slide for requests to connect to the transmission network. So that's, you know, essentially bigger generation assets or big demand. So if you're looking at a smaller scale, you know, for a company or a home or a small business, they would be typically connecting to the distribution network. You know, I think there are in some cases, in some areas, some challenges with distribution network connections. And there is, you know, a parallel need to keep upgrading the distribution network in line with electrification, but probably overall there isn't the same big issue of a connection queue that we have at the transmission level. So whoever's asked the question should probably not worry too much that they would be able to get a connection for their solar system reasonably quickly, I think.
Thanks, Roy. It's another one for you, Roy, because I know this is one of your favourite topics. So we've got two questions on REMA.
Yes.
If I do the second one first, probably makes sense. If the introduction of zonal pricing is decided through REMA, when do you think the earliest it would apply from?
Yeah, so I said, I mean, there are different views on how long it would take, but I would say that the consensus view, and probably also the view, as far as we can tell, of DESNZ officials, is that it would be around about 5 years between an in-principle decision to move to zonal pricing and the point at which zonal wholesale markets would come into force across the GB market as a whole. And why such a long time? So I guess just to elaborate a little, a lot of decisions would be needed on how that zonal market would operate. So firstly, you know, how many zones are there? Where are the boundaries between the zones? You know, do they ever change? And what's the process for changing them? How do you trade between zones? Do you expose all customers to different zonal prices or only certain customers? Do you protect certain categories of project or customer from the impacts of zonal pricing because they didn't know that they were going to come, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of subsequent questions to be answered, as well as the associated changes in the law and regulations that govern the electricity market that would all need to be decisions made and changes introduced. And that's, I guess, gives some flavour as to why it would take a significant number of years at the very least.
Thanks, Roy. And the related question, I think they've talked about locational wholesale costs, but I think, again, if zonal was agreed, do you feel this would have an impact on market liquidity?
Yes, we do. And that is one of our concerns about zonal pricing, is obviously the smaller, if you have a lot of zones, then all of those individual markets are smaller. And that does raised questions around whether they would be sufficiently liquid for people to trade easily. You know, we don't think that liquidity in the current national GB market is particularly good, even today. So it is a concern of ours that that could worsen in a zonal market. Yes, is one of a range of reasons why we aren't as a company that keen on the option.
Thanks, Roy. Change of topic then, a bit of a general question. Are there any other sustainability related policies or regulations that EDF is concerned about for 2025?
Not concerned, I don't think. There obviously is, you know, constantly change and development ongoing. And it's probably too long a question to talk through today, but I wonder whether it's one of those we want to take away, discuss with sustainability colleagues and come back with a bit of a view on, Eloise. Okay, brilliant. We'll come back on that one then, Morgan. What's next? So if Sizewell C is approved, I don't know if we'll have an answer for this one actually, but I'll just check in case Dan wants to say anything on it. When do you expect the new RAB costs to start on customer bills? And this bit I'm pretty sure we don't have. Do you have a pound per megawatt hour forecast of how much this will be? So we don't. When I say we don't, you know, within the group of us three on here. Yeah, we don't, unfortunately. I think timelines from when you get to a point of sort of final investment decision being made, the timelines are sort of set out that the RAB model can start reasonably soon after. We're talking months. But it all comes down to when decisions are made to give you firm answers on cost or exact deadlines and exact timelines. So I think it comes back to Eloise's earlier point that when we know more, we make sure we're communicating with our customers as soon as possible to make sure they're as prepared as they can be. But it does depend on when decisions are made. That first say, Eloise? Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Dan. I've got two questions, but I think they're asking the same question really, so I'll read the first one. With the clean power policy and the lowering influence of gas, do you see a disaggregation of power from the wholesale gas market? And when might you see that link kind of falling away?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Not a super simple one to answer. I think what we do see is that as renewables become a bigger and bigger proportion of the electricity system and the contribution from gas is declining, that the sort of frequency of times that gas will be dominant in setting power prices will gradually fall. And there will be more and more occasions when gas is less significant or not a factor in the same way as it is today in impacting on power prices. That will be a gradual process, and you know, obviously that then is dependent on the rate that we prove to be able to decarbonize and the speed with which we can move away from gas. I think the other factor in this area is the sort of growth of the contract for difference scheme and the more and more generation that we're seeing on that scheme. And obviously that has a sort of levelling effect on wholesale power prices through the confirmed strike prices. And as more and more generation is on CFDs, that will should have a smoothing effect over time on bills, or it will sort of kind of counteract to some extent. You know, if you've got high prices from expensive gas, but you've got a lot of projects on CFDs, that will dampen the effect of high gas prices. And conversely, in periods when you've got lots and lots of wind and very cheap wholesale power prices, they will be topped up by the CFD mechanism. So the overall effect should be to gradually deliver smoother and less volatile power prices, but as I say, that will be a gradual process that we'll see, I think, you know, over time, over 3, 4, 5, and then beyond, even into the 2030s, probably continue to see that effect.
Thanks, Roy. We've got a return to zonal pricing. It's obviously an interesting one that gets people thinking about all the complexity. And it's a little bit specific, but I think the gist of it, so they're asking about how would this impact on baskets if zonal pricing came in, and they mentioned a specific basket, but I think the point is, obviously, if you've got a basket of sites that are spread across different regions, how might they be impacted? I guess by lots more complexity is probably the short answer, is it, Roy?
Yes, and obviously, yeah, as I mentioned, some of that complexity is one of our concerns and challenges about zonal pricing. Obviously, ultimately, what the impact is depends on, where the zones are, how they're defined, what the balance between supply and demand in each zone is, and that will drive the power prices and the extent to which there are different prices in different zones. Until we, if we do go down the route of zonal pricing, it'll be even quite a long time probably before we're able to forecast what the price will be in different zones, because it will depend very much on those boundaries and how many zones there are and so on. I mean, obviously the broad picture one can forecast would be that in the north and in Scotland, power prices would be cheaper because that's where a lot of the wind is, and in the south, power prices would be, either similar to what they are today or potentially a bit more expensive in some cases. But that's a little bit speculative, and obviously the other factor is that over time, you would expect potentially that the market will adjust and people will build and move in response to zonal prices. So that initial picture may change over time as well.
And we're expected to hear the middle of this year. Are we expecting to hear a decision between zonal and national? Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
I think while we're expected to hear a decision, I suppose even some of these more detailed or specific questions may actually be a much later point before we can answer them with any increased degree of certainty, because there are, as Roy said, there are lots of variables at play that will have an impact.
Brilliant. We've got two questions that are around kind of net zero targets. So one is asking, do local business sited solar, so I guess if a business has their own solar, become less important in achieving net zero, given that network scale projects are aiming to decarbonise the network anyway?
I suppose it's an interesting question. I suppose it depends on the rationale and I guess the business case and the justification for the investment in the project, right? If we're moving towards clean power by 2030, the carbon intensity of the grid overall will decrease. Maybe that becomes less of a driving factor in a decision to install on-site solar. But there'll be other factors that also help shape that business decision, including ultimately cost and final energy bills for that customer. So I don't think it necessarily changes. It may change the rationale for it, but it doesn't remove a rationale for those investments.
Thank you. And a simple one here. Do PPAs count towards an organisation's net zero targets?
Depends on the PPA and the targets. Unfortunately, it's one. If someone wants to drop us a more detailed question about their particular arrangements, we're happy to take that away and consider it. But I'm afraid it's a it depends answer.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I don't know, Dan. I've got one or two more questions, but I don't know, just before we lose too many people, if it's worth flicking to the next slide. Just to make sure people have got the details. So if anyone did have a question they didn't get to ask or want to get a bit more information, then do use that email address, and do follow us on our LinkedIn, EDF Business Solutions. where we'll obviously update on all of the things we've talked about as they become more detailed. I'm just going to give you one last question. It's on, I understand that the introduction of a new hydrogen levy on gas shippers has been proposed, which they're expecting will be passed through via CAS transportation charge from 2026. Do you have any further information on the likely cost to the end user in the commercial space? And are there any other new levies on the horizon? Nice little follow-up.
I can start with that one, Eloise. So the questioner is right in that the government has taken a power to introduce a hydrogen levy and to put it onto gas shippers, which would obviously ultimately find its way onto gas bills. However, as things stand, the government and that legislation was introduced under the former Conservative government. The new government has not yet done anything more on that in terms of consultation or implementation of the details of a levy of that kind. So you know, as things stand, it's not in place, and we're not quite sure whether the government still intends to progress with that. They didn't mention it at all in their hydrogen update document that they published just before Christmas. So I think there's a little bit of uncertainty on that now, to be honest. Eloise, the power is there, but whether it is used to support the early hydrogen projects, we don't know as yet.
Okay.
Perhaps the other thing to say on that is just perhaps a little bit of reassurance to people who might be worried about that, is that the early hydrogen projects are small, and they're still at their very early stages. You know, they're getting contracts, they'll take a few years to build out, they won't be producing huge amounts of hydrogen. So even if the levy is progressed, the initial impact of it in terms of a bill cost would be very modest. But the questioner is right that, you know, over time that could become a substantial new cost item, a policy item on bills. But obviously with some other costs such as the RO gradually falling away from 2027 onwards, so there would be some countervailing trends. Dan, are there any others on the horizon that I can't immediately think of any others.
Talked about RAB, haven't we? Biomethane, looking
Possibly, yes.
but again, very small and would
Yeah.
be captured via the CFD process primarily, we guess. Yeah. Nothing immediately comes to mind.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Roy. I think we've definitely come to the end of our time. As I say, I think we've managed to cover most of the questions, but do email in if you want anything answering that we didn't get to. Thanks for joining, and thanks, Dan and Roy, for all of your amazing insights. And hopefully we'll see you at another Talk Power event soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.